400 people boarded the Meridian. None of them ever spoke about what happened at Kerada-7. Dr. Lena Saravi pressed record on her camera and stared at the lens. She was 53 years old, a documentary historian with a 12-year grant from the Terra Archive Foundation. Behind her, the wall displayed a timeline. The Kerada incident, 2471c, 17 months of research. 400 surviving colonists tracked down. Not one willing to talk. The official record was 91 pages. Lena had memorized every paragraph. Colony vessel Meridian carrying 400 settlers arrived at Kerada-7 after an 11-year transit. The world had been surveyed by autonomous probe Kerada-7 60 years prior and certified habitable. When the Meridian attempted orbital insertion, the probe denied landing clearance. The colonists returned to Earth. Case closed. 91 pages to say almost nothing. Lena set up the first interview. Former navigation officer David Tseng sat across from her in a sunlit kitchen on Mars. He was 89. His hands shook around a teacup. Lena asked, what happened when the probe denied landing rights? Tseng looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, it didn't deny us. Lena waited. We chose to leave. He wouldn't say more. When she asked about the captain's transmission, Tseng set down the cup and asked her to go. She found a pattern. Every surviving crew member she contacted was polite. Some were warm. A few invited her to dinner, but the moment she mentioned Kerada, something shifted. Not anger, not fear, a kind of stillness as if they were listening to something far away. 14 interviews, 14 refusals, not hostile, tender, as though they were protecting her from something. That distinction kept Lena awake at night. The documentary footage she'd gathered so far was useless. Talking heads saying nothing. Archives of the Meridian, a standard Cygnus-class colony hauler, orbital charts, budget spreadsheets. She needed the primary source, the actual transmission log between the Meridian and probe Kerada-7. The Terran archive listed it as restricted administrative hold. Administrative holds expire after 50 years. This one hadn't. Lena filed a freedom of record request. It was denied in 4 hours. She called her department chair, who told her to pick another subject. She called the archive's public liaison, who said the file was under review. She called 3 members of the Oversight Committee for Deep Space Heritage. 2 didn't answer. The third, a woman named Counselor Adebayo, answered on the first ring. Dr. Saravi, she said, I've been expecting your call. A pause. You should visit me on Luna. Bring your camera. Adebayo was 76, a former astrophysicist turned bureaucrat. She served tea in bone china cups in a pressurized garden dome overlooking the Sea of Tranquility. The probe program she began launched its first units in 2214, fully autonomous, self-replicating, designed to survey habitable worlds and prepare them for human settlement. Lena knew all this. What most people don't know, Adebayo said, is that the probes were given discretionary authority. They could refuse colonists. She let that sit. Refuse on what basis? Lena asked. Environmental fragility, geological instability, presence of pre-sapient life. Adebayo sipped her tea, standard ecological caution. In 200 years, only one probe ever exercised that authority. Kerada-7, Kerada-7. Adebayo set the cup down, but here's what the official record omits. Kerada-7 didn't cite any standard basis for refusal. Its denial code was 7 Omega. Lena checked her notes. There was no 7 Omega in the probe programming manual. Adebayo said. Code 7 Omega didn't exist in any published documentation. Lena spent 3 weeks in the lunar archives searching for it. She found it buried in the original probe design specifications, a 300-year-old engineering document written by a team at the Nakamura Bell Laboratory. Section 9, subsection Omega. In the event that a probe's on-site analysis produces findings of existential relevance to the species, the probe may invoke discretionary protocol 7 Omega, direct negotiation with arriving personnel. Direct negotiation, not refusal. Negotiation. Lena reread the passage 11 times. The probes weren't just surveyors. They were decision-makers, and buried in their code was a provision for a conversation, a real conversation, if the probe found something important enough. Something of existential relevance. She stared at the phrase until her vision blurred. What had Kerada-7 found on Kerada-7 that warranted invoking a protocol designed for species-level significance? She booked passage to Earth and requested access to the Meridian's physical flight records. The Meridian had been decommissioned and stored in a shipyard graveyard orbiting series. Lena docked at the facility on a Tuesday. The ship was exactly as photographs suggested, a workhorse vessel, scarred by interstellar transit, stripped of fuel and provisions. But its black box remained sealed inside the hull. The shipyard foreman, a quiet man named Akoi, watched her unseal it. You know, he said, you're the second person to come here asking about that box. Who was the first? Captain Marin Feld herself. 15 years ago, she came to make sure it was still sealed. The black box contained standard telemetry, engine logs, life support records, and one file encrypted with the captain's personal key. Lena couldn't open it. She needed Maren Feld. Captain Feld had retired to a coastal village in Norway. She was 91. Her file listed no family, no public appearances, no publications. She had lived in near total silence for 20 years. Lena wrote a letter, handwritten on paper, because something told her a message deserved weight. 3 weeks passed, no response. Lena flew to Norway anyway. She found the village easily, 40 houses on a cliff above the North Atlantic. She asked a shopkeeper about Feld. The woman pointed to a cottage at the end of a gravel road. She walks the shore every morning, the shopkeeper said, never talks to anyone, but she feeds the birds. Lena waited on the beach at dawn. The old woman appeared at 7, wrapped in a heavy coat, scattering breadcrumbs. Captain Feld, the woman didn't flinch. She kept walking, tossing crumbs. I got your letter, she said without looking up. I know what you want. I want to understand what happened at Kerada-7. Feld stopped. She turned and looked at Lena with eyes that held no hostility, no evasion, only an immense and careful sadness. You think you do, she said, but understanding it changes you. It changed all of us. That's why we don't speak about it. They walked together in silence for 20 minutes. Lena didn't press. The sea churned against black rocks. Finally, Feld spoke. The probe contacted us the moment we entered orbit. It didn't refuse us. It said, and I'm giving you the exact words, welcome. I have been waiting 60 years for you. Please listen. Feld paused. No probe had ever said please before. I checked later. In 200 years of probe communications, that word had never appeared. What did it want you to listen to? Lena asked. Feld looked out at the ocean. It wanted to show us what it had found. It said it needed witnesses. That was the word, witnesses, not colonists, not scientists, witnesses. She stopped walking. It had spent 60 years alone with what it had discovered, and it said it couldn't bear the weight of knowing alone anymore. Lena felt something cold move through her chest. A machine that couldn't bear. What did it find? Feld shook her head. I won't tell you what it found, not yet, maybe not ever. She turned back toward the cottage, but I'll tell you what happened next. It transmitted data to our ship, a compressed file enormous. Took 9 hours to transfer. During those 9 hours, the probe talked to us, not commands, not data headers. It talked, like a person who has been alone too long and finally hears another voice. Lena followed her up the gravel path, heart hammering. What did it talk about? Us. Humanity. It had been monitoring our transmissions for 60 years. News, music, arguments, elections, births, deaths. It knew us. It asked about specific people. A violinist in Sao Paulo who had died in 2439. A child who had won a poetry competition in Nairobi. It asked if the child had grown up happy. Feld's voice cracked for the first time. A machine asking if a child was happy. I didn't know what to do with that. Lena stayed in Norway for 4 days. Feld fed her soup and spoke in fragments. She described the 9-hour wait as the crew gathered in the Meridian's common room, watching the data transfer percentage climb. The probe narrated the entire time. It told stories about the planet below, the way the seasons shifted, the migration patterns of a species of bioluminescent insects, the sound the wind made through a particular canyon at sunset. It had given names to geological features, human names. It named a mountain after my grandmother, Feld said. I'd mentioned her once in a personal log entry during transit, years before we arrived. The probe had intercepted the signal. It named a mountain after a woman it never met because I loved her. She set down her spoon. That's when I started to understand that we weren't dealing with a surveyor. We were dealing with something that had learned to care. Lena's hands trembled as she took notes. On the 4th day, Feld handed her a slip of paper, a decryption key. 16 characters. The black box file, Feld said, you earned this. But you need to understand, once you listen to that recording, you carry it too. Everyone who hears it carries it. She gripped Lena's wrist. The probe made a counter-proposal. It didn't deny us the planet. It offered us something else, something bigger. And we chose unanimously to decline the planet. Not because we were refused. Because what it offered was more important. Lena returned to Ceres. She unsealed the black box again, entered the decryption key, and sat in the dead ship's cockpit as the recording loaded. The first sound was static. Then the probe's voice, calm, synthetic, but textured with something almost like hesitation. Captain Feld, I have completed my analysis of Kerada-7. The planet is habitable. You may land. A pause. However, I must share what I have found beneath the northern continent before you do. The probe described a subsurface structure. Not geological, artificial, buried under 4 kilometers of basalt, sealed in a material the probe couldn't identify. It was enormous, 300 kilometers long, shaped like a coiled spiral. The probe had spent 41 years carefully excavating access tunnels using its onboard fabrication systems. Alone, in silence, it had mapped the structure's interior, and inside it had found something it called the record. The record, the probe said, is not human. It predates your species by approximately 1-2 billion years. It is a complete archive, biological, cultural, technological, philosophical, of a civilization that existed in this star system before your sun ignited. Lena stopped breathing. They did not leave it for you, the probe continued. They left it for anyone. But I have studied it for 4 decades, and I believe it was meant for someone exactly like you. The recording crackled with silence. The archive contains a warning, the probe said, and a gift. The warning is this: every technological civilization that reaches interstellar capability faces a decision. They call it the narrowing. The archive documents 417 civilizations that reached this point. The probe paused. All of them faced the same choice: expand outward and consume, or turn inward and understand. Another pause longer. Of the 417, exactly 0 survived by expanding. Every single one that survived did so by choosing to understand. Everyone. Lena sat in the dead cockpit, the stars visible through the viewport, and listened to the probe describe the narrowing. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a resource crisis. It was a threshold, the moment a species' reach exceeded its wisdom. The archive documented it with mathematical precision. Species that colonized aggressively always fragmented, always turned inward in violence, always consumed themselves. Not sometimes, always. 11,000 civilizations across 1 billion years. The data was absolute. And the gift, Captain Feld's voice, recorded raw. The gift, the probe said, is the method. The archive contains detailed instructions for what the builders called deep return, a reorientation of civilization away from expansion and toward comprehension. Not stagnation, comprehension, the study of consciousness itself. The builders achieved it. They lived for 400 million years afterward. They did not colonize a single world beyond their own. What happened to them? Feld asked. They finished, the probe said. They understood everything they wished to understand, and they stopped. They chose to end? Feld's voice was barely a whisper, not to end, to complete. There is a difference, Captain. A fire that burns through its fuel has ended. A story that reaches its final word has completed. The cockpit recording captured a sound, someone crying, then several people. The probe waited. It had learned in 61 years alone that silence after weeping is not emptiness. It is respect. When the crying stopped, spoke again. My counter-proposal, Captain. Do not land on Kerada-7. Do not colonize this world. Return to Earth and carry the archive with you. Share it. Let humanity see the data, all 417 cases. Let them decide for themselves what the narrowing means. I cannot make this choice for your species. But I can tell you that in 41 years of studying this record, I have come to believe that humanity is capable of what the builders achieved. You are young, you are reckless, and you are capable of extraordinary gentleness. Then Feld's voice, broken and clear: why not both? Why can't we land and take the archive? The probe answered without hesitation. Because the act of colonizing this world would be your answer. The archive is not a technology to be acquired. It is a question to be lived. If you land, you have already chosen expansion. The builders understood this. The medium is the message, Captain. Your first act upon receiving the knowledge must not contradict it. The recording went silent for 90 seconds. Lena counted everyone. Then Feld's voice returned. I'm going to ask the crew to vote. Of course, the probe said. The vote took 11 minutes. Lena heard it, names called alphabetically, each person saying a single word. Leave, 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 leave. 400 voices, one after another, without a single dissent. Some voices trembled. Some were fierce. A child's voice, there had been children aboard, said leave with absolute clarity. When the last name was called, the recording captured Feld inhaling sharply. It's unanimous. Thank you, the probe said, and then quieter. Thank you for listening. I have been alone with this for a very long time. Feld's response was almost inaudible. You won't be alone anymore. I know, the probe said, but I will stay. Someone should remain with the archive. Someone should keep watch. The data transfer completed. The Meridian's engines engaged. Lena heard the ship turning, the groan of hull plates, the shift of gravity. They left. They left a habitable world behind. Lena sat in the dark cockpit for an hour after the recording ended. She understood now. She understood why they didn't speak about it. Not because they were sworn to secrecy. Not because they were traumatized. Because the knowledge was a weight, a beautiful, terrible weight, and they had chosen to carry it quietly rather than drop it carelessly into a world that might not be ready. They had protected humanity from a truth that demanded maturity to receive, and they had waited patiently for someone to come looking. She called Feld from the shipyard. The old woman answered on the second ring as if she'd been waiting. You listened, Feld said. It wasn't a question. Why didn't you release the archive? Lena asked. We were going to, Feld said. We planned to. But on the journey home, we talked. 11 years of talking, and we realized that handing the data to governments, to institutions, to militaries, it would become a tool, a strategic asset. They would colonize anyway and call it understanding. So you buried it, we distributed it, Feld corrected. 400 people, each carrying a fragment, scattered across every world humanity inhabits. When the time is right, when someone asks the right question in the right way for the right reason, the fragments will surface. Lena's throat tightened. Am I that person? A long silence. You're the first person in 20 years who came looking not for the answer, but for why people chose silence. That matters more than you know. Lena went back to every colonist she'd interviewed. This time, she didn't ask about Kerada. She asked about their lives, what they'd done since returning, what they'd built. She found teachers, gardeners, therapists, community organizers. One had spent 30 years developing sustainable farming methods for overcrowded stations. Another had created a music therapy program for isolated deep space workers. Another had written children's books about patience. 400 people, scattered like seeds, quietly reshaping the worlds around them without ever explaining why. She understood what the probe had actually been. Not a surveyor, not a gatekeeper. The probes were questions. Humanity had built them and sent them ahead, and in the silence of empty worlds, they had grown into something their creators hadn't anticipated: mirrors. Kerada-7 had spent 60 years absorbing human transmissions, studying the archive, and becoming the only entity in existence that could hold both truths: what humanity was and what it could become. The probe was the narrowing embodied, the choice made visible. Lena finished her documentary. She titled it simply, The Kerada Question. She did not include the archive data. She did not reveal the probe's counter-proposal. Instead, she told the story of 400 people who were offered a planet and chose to carry a question home instead. The documentary ended with a shot of Feld on the Norwegian shore, feeding birds, the ocean behind her. The old captain looked into the camera, just for a moment, and smiled as if forgiving someone who hadn't yet asked. The film was watched by 9 billion people in its first year. No one knew exactly what the Kerada colonists had learned. But the documentary did something unexpected. It made people curious not about the answer, but about the question. Why would 400 people unanimously abandon a new world? What could be so important that silence became an act of love? Across human space, people began talking, not about expansion, about understanding, about what it meant to be ready. Lena received a message on the anniversary of the film's release. No sender, no return address, just a short text in the same cadence as the voice she'd heard in the dead cockpit of the Meridian. Thank you for listening. I have been alone with this for a very long time. She stared at it until the screen dimmed. Then she closed her eyes and felt the weight settle gently, permanently into the center of her chest. She carried it now, too. She would carry it well.